Dearest grandson, 64 years ago, your grandmother and I set out on the greatest journey of our lives. At the same time, neither of us could imagine the road that lay before us, with its hills and valleys, its pleasures and pains. Over the years, we learned the reality of those words we spoke so solemnly on our wedding day. For richer or poorer, though mostly poorer, for better or worse, in sickness and in health. And now more than ever, I feel the weight of the words, till death do us part. Oh, how I miss her. But now that same journey is before you. And thinking about the joy that awaits you both gives me joy as well. With that being said, I want you to have a successful marriage. I believe the proof is in the reading. The answers are in the book. So here is a special gift that I want you to have. I love you with all my heart, Grandpa.
Well, let's grab our Bibles and turn to Ephesians chapter 6. And we're in our series that we're calling Happily Even After, with a special day, a special message for Father's Day that just happened to fall in the perfect place. And the title of my message is Needed Superheroes. You know, that new Superman movie is out, The Man of Steel. And the success of all of these superhero films has really been amazing over the last number of years. Spider-Man, Batman, Iron Man, Thor, the list goes on. But you know, when you really get down and size up superheroes, Superman is at the top of the heap, right? I mean, we all remember that old TV show, or some of us do, when they would describe Superman, he's faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound, up in the sky. It's a bird, it's a plane, it's Superman. And then they go on to talk about who he is, and now he's been reimagined in this new film. But really, the problem is, of course, with all these superheroes is, well, they're not real. It's fiction. They come from comic books. But I want to talk about what I believe is a real superhero, or a Superman, and he's called Dad. Now, I don't mean just a biological father. There's plenty of them, and many, unfortunately, who walk out on their wives and walk out on their families. No, it's more than just being a biological father. I'm talking about the dad that stays married to his wife. I'm talking about the dad that raises his children. I'm talking about the dad that follows the Lord and is a godly role model. To me, that is a Superman in today's culture. You know, there was a time when that sort of thing was expected. Men were expected to stand by the commitment that they've made, but things have changed dramatically, and I think we're all very aware of that. If you were to identify one problem in America today, apart from just sin itself, that would be at the root of almost every social ill we are facing, I think it would be the breakdown of the family, and more specifically, the absence of male leadership. I'm talking about fatherless homes, and I've got the stats to back it up. You know, throughout history, men have been torn from their families by war, disease, and death. But as we come to the 21st century now, on a scale never before seen, men are disconnecting from their families at a huge rate. And one expert said, we are in danger of becoming a fatherless society. Some would say, well, you know, I know that's not optimal to have only a mother raising the children, or for that point, only a father. But, you know, moms do a good job, and yet they do, and they pick up the slack. But let's just look at the statistics and think about them. Fatherless children are anywhere from 100 to 200% more likely to have emotional and behavioral problems. A child that comes from a fatherless home is 68% more likely to use drugs or alcohol, far more likely to become sexually active at an early age, and 3 times more likely to commit a violent crime. 63% of teenagers who attempt suicide come from fatherless homes. 71% of high school dropouts come from fatherless homes. 90% of all homeless and runaway children are from fatherless homes. 85% of youths sitting in prisons today grew up in a fatherless home. Fatherless sons are 300% more likely to become incarcerated in state juvenile institutions. Fatherless daughters who marry have a 92% higher divorce rate, and fatherless sons a 35% higher divorce rate. Fatherless daughters are 53% more likely to marry as teenagers. Fatherless daughters are 111% more likely to have children as teenagers, and they're 164% more likely to have an out-of-wedlock birth. 80% of teenagers admitted to psychiatric hospitals come from fatherless homes. I think I kind of make my point, right? So the stats bear this out. Don't let anyone tell you that family doesn't matter. These are secular statistics that I pulled from a number of research sites that all are confirmed in multiple sites. So this is simply the facts that are before us today. James Merritt made this statement, and I quote, "The most endangered species in America is not the spotted owl or the snail daughter, but the responsible father," end quote. So you can see why I'm saying fathers who do their part, who take their position seriously, really are like superheroes. Now listen, today, my desire is not to beat you up, dads. My desire is to lift you up and to encourage you and to thank you for all that you do. Now, it is interesting that on Mother's Day, church attendance goes up, and on Father's Day, generally, church attendance goes down. The most highly attended day at church is Christmas and Easter, followed by Mother's Day. Father's Day doesn't even register in the top 10. One little boy said, "Father's Day is like Mother's Day, except you don't have to spend as much on the gift." Don't you think that's kind of true? But the fact that you guys are here today says a lot about you. That you are making a stand. And but I'll tell you what, these stats, as you think about them, are even true in the animal kingdom. I mentioned James Merritt is a friend of mine, and he's spoken here before. He wrote an excellent book with the title, "Being Fathers in a Fatherless World." And here's what he points out in his book. At Kruger National Park is the largest wildlife preserve in South Africa. 30 years ago, the elephant population exceeded the park's capacity to sustain it. So a decision was made to kill off some of the adult elephants and relocate some of the younger elephants. And these young bulls were resettled in Palensburg National Park. All seemed well for a few years, and then some serious problems began to develop. There was an unexplained slaughter of rhinos taking place in Palensburg National Park. They thought immediately it was poachers, because poachers often kill the rhino thinking that the horn has special powers. We won't go into that. But as it turns out, after they did surveillance, it was not poachers at all. It was actually the young elephant bulls chasing down the rhinos and goring them to death with their tusks. Now, they were trying to figure out why this was happening, because this was abnormal in the animal kingdom. Well, it turned out that these younger elephants were in fact orphans. They had been disconnected from the male elephants, and thus they had effectively formed gangs replete with gang leaders. Can you imagine that? Elephant gangs. They were getting all tatted up. They had leather jackets. Now, I don't know about that, but so they're running around in packs and gangs, attacking the older elephants and killing them. So they came up with a possible solution. They decided to bring in some older, more mature bull elephants to function as a foster father, big brother project. Within weeks, discipline was restored, and the younger elephants bonded with the older ones, imitating and exhibiting more acceptable behavior. There were no more reports of killed rhinos. Isn't that fascinating? So what does this say to us? It says we need elephants in America, specifically older ones who are male. No, it doesn't say that at all. One expert concluded, even in the animal world, the presence of father figures is essential to civil behavior, discipline, and rational decorum with others, end quote. So this is a principle that is clear for everyone to see. And it is such a blessing to be a dad. Psalm 127 says, children are a heritage from the Lord. Children are a reward from him. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are sons born in one's youth. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. Also, Proverbs 20, verse 7 says, the righteous man walks in his integrity, and his children are blessed after him. So what a role the father plays in our culture. You know, it's interesting coming back to this verse 3 of 127 from Psalms. He says, children are a heritage from the Lord. Another way to translate the word heritage is gift. Children are a gift from God. They are ours to unfold. They're not there for us to mold as much as they are there to unfold. They're not ours to keep, but rather to nurture. And I don't think you can fully understand the importance of the role of a father. And just so I don't leave your moms out today, I'm not ignoring you. We've already talked about your significant role, but I'm including you in this in many ways. But to understand the role of parents, I don't think we can fully see how significant it is until our kids get older. You know, sometimes a lot of people come up to me and say, you know, our children, they love the Lord so much, and they've never gone into a time of rebellion because we've raised them in the name of the Lord. Oh, that's great. How old are your kids? They're 5 and 6. It's like, you know, shut up. You don't know what you're talking about. Until you've gone through the treacherous waters of teen years, you don't know what it's like to raise a kid. And this is not new to our culture. Mark Twain wrote years ago, quote, things run along pretty smoothly until your kid reaches 13. That's a time to stick him in a barrel, hammer the lid down nice and snug, and feed him through the knothole. Then when they turn 16, plug up the knothole. So we're living in a time, though, that does not support the role of what we might call the traditional father, but I'm talking more about the biblical father. But that idea of a father that's a stabilizing force, that's a leader that works hard, that's actually mocked outright. But some are beginning to see the light a little bit on this. I read an article in a major magazine about the problem of a lack of good fathers. And this article said, and I quote, fathers on TV come in two principal varieties, Mr. Mom and Fat Pig. The most popular shows of the last 30 years have all been about family, and they have all had a failed dad at the center. The Mr. Mom type was defined by the defeated, awkward, confounded Raymond on the ironically titled Everyone Loves Raymond. The loser dad was central to a program called Blank, My Dad Says. We won't fill that gap in. And remains a staple figure on shows today like Guys with Kids. Now, I haven't watched any of those programs, so I don't really know what the essential message of them is, but this is a secular article in a magazine pointing out that fathers have been denigrated, but along comes a show that breaks all the rules and sets a new precedent. It's called Duck Dynasty. Okay, now I want you to think about this for a moment. Duck Dynasty is the #1 non-fictional TV series on cable. It's beaten out American Idol and Survivor, and the coveted 18 to 49 demographic. See, this is what a lot of these advertisers are going for, this younger demographic. Duck Dynasty is very popular with younger people. What is Duck Dynasty? How many of you have seen the program? Raise your hand up. How many of you have not seen it? Okay, let me give you the basic premise of the show. This is not going to sound all that interesting to you. It's a story of the Robertson family who own a duck call business in Louisiana. They have a patriarch in the family, Phil Robertson, and a matriarch that they call Miss Kay. And they have their children who are all married, and they have their grandchildren. And most of the major figures, at least the guys, have long, scraggly beards and long hair, and they love to go out and hunt and fish and all that. And so when you first watch it, you think, well, this is just a show about rednecks, basically. And they're very proud of their redneckness, if you will. And they talk about it a lot. But then it begins to dawn on you that this is a Christian family that have biblical values, and every show ends with the whole family gathered around the table praying before they eat. It's sort of like the new Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, or the Donna Reed Show, except the father goes out and shoots his animals and eats them. And they have a special fondness for squirrel brains. But here's what's interesting. It's about the family. And more than being about the family, it's about the Christian family. And I think young people today, so many of them coming from fatherless homes, really long for that deep down inside. You probably heard about Paris Jackson, the daughter of Michael Jackson, recently attempting suicide. Now, this girl has had an unusual life, to say the least, in the home she was raised in. And her father, Michael Jackson, died in 2009. And shortly before her suicide attempt, she tweeted a Beatles song. And she said, "Yesterday, all my troubles seemed so far away. Now it looks as though they're here to stay." And then she tried to take her own life. And I actually put a Facebook post out that was picked up by a couple of news sites and got some traction out there. And here's what I said in sort of an open letter to Paris Jackson. I said, I pray Paris Jackson will hear the good news that Jesus loves her. And I pray that whatever pain she is facing, she would know that though her earthly father is gone, she has a Father in heaven who wants to give her meaning and purpose in her life. And then to Paris I wrote, don't take your life, but rather dedicate it to Jesus Christ. And if you do that, you'll find the happiness you desire and also the hope of heaven. You know, I hope she read that because she's searching. My heart goes out to kids from fatherless homes. Why? I think the answer is pretty obvious. I came from a fatherless home. More to the point, I was conceived out of wedlock. I was not planned. In fact, my mom lied to me for most of my adult life about who my biological father was. I did locate him finally, and he was in the advanced stages of Alzheimer's. And so he didn't know who I was, and he didn't even remember my mom. So it was a little disheartening, to say the least. But having grown up without a father figure in my life, I understand what is happening to these kids. And what was the exception in my time is now the norm in our time today. Back when I was a kid from a divorced home, almost all my friends had moms and dads, and I was the guy who came from the broken home. But now, to be in a classroom and to have an intact family, you would be the exception, not the rule, with the way things are going today. So this pain has enlarged my heart to reach out, especially to younger people. And that's one of the reasons we do our crusades, because we want to offer young kids like Paris Jackson hope and tell them they can come into a relationship with God. Because you see, God became the father I never had. God was there to bring stability to a life of complete chaos. And so we want that message to get out to others. And I think our full appreciation for fathers is not fully realized until our children become parents, right? And they find themselves saying the things they vowed they would never say. Like, what do you think, I have a money tree somewhere? And, oh, okay, fine. So if all of your friends jumped off a cliff, would you do that too? Yeah, we find ourselves saying the things we vowed we would never say. D.L. Moody, the great evangelist, made this statement, and I quote, "If you want to know what kind of father you were, don't look at your children, look at your grandchildren." That's a good statement. Because then you see what kind of job you did as you watch what kind of job your kids are doing. By the way, both my sons are great fathers. I'm reminded about a clipping I read in a Dutch magazine I read a number of years ago. It sort of shows the way a child perceives their father with the passing of time. At 4 years old, the child says, "My daddy can do anything." At 7 years, he says, "My daddy knows a lot. A whole lot." At 8 years, he says, "Well, my father doesn't know everything." At 12 years, he says, "Oh, naturally, Dad doesn't know that either." At 14 years, he says, "Dad is so old school, he just doesn't get it." At 21 years, "Dad is so lame." At 25 years, he says, "Dad knows a little about that, but not too much." At 30 years, "Well, let's find out what Dad thinks about that." At 35 years, before we decide, we have to get Dad's idea first. At 50 years, what would Dad have thought about that? At 60 years, my dad knew literally everything. At 65 years, I wish I could talk it over with Dad one more time. You know, that's why the Bible tells us to honor our father and our mother. And I think it's very important that you let your father know that you love him now. Don't wait until later. Okay, so let's go to Ephesians 6 and let's read verse 4. And this will be our primary text for today. "You fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord." So here now are the words of the Apostle Paul to parents. Even as Paul addresses his primary words to husbands in the marriage, husbands, love your wife as Christ loves the church. Now in dealing with parenting, he zeroes in on the dad. Why is this? Maybe it's because women more naturally assume the role of mother, while fathers often fail to measure up to the standard that God has set. Thus, Paul addresses his words to the father. Fathers, pay attention. Here's what you are to do. Don't provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. What does that mean? The phrase provoke, or the word provoke, means to anger them. It suggests a repeated behavior or treatment that causes the child to have anger and resentment that ultimately boils over into outright hostility. Okay, but how would we as dads ever provoke our children? Well, there's a lot of ways. Number one would be to show favoritism. Show favoritism. You know, kids aren't stupid. They know when you favor one over the other. Any of you who have siblings probably know who the favored child was in the home. You know if it was you. You know if it was instead your brother or your sister. It's when you say things to your kids like, you know, why can't you be smarter like your sister? Why can't you be more athletic like your brother? Why can't you be like them more? And they immediately begin to feel that you think less of them. Don't show favoritism. Even if in your heart you favor one child over another, try to be as even as you can. And when I buy gifts for my grandkids, I have 4 granddaughters now and a grandson. And I only had 2 granddaughters to start with, but my family has expanded quite dramatically. And when I go out and buy a gift, my wife says, now if you get a gift for one of those granddaughters, you have to get it for all of them. Where before, when I only had one granddaughter, Stella, and I would buy her this and I'd buy her that, now everything is times 4. And I think twice. Oh, I'm going to buy this. Oh, times 4. Maybe I'll get something smaller. So you sort of adjust a little bit, right? But showing favoritism. We see this in the Bible. It's illustrated in the story of Jacob and Esau. Isaac, the father of the two boys, clearly favored Esau, and Rebekah, the mother, clearly favored Isaac. Excuse me, I got that wrong. Isaac favored Esau, and Rebekah favored Jacob. And so this produced a rivalry in the boys that carried on for the rest of their lives. Now, Jacob, having not been the favored son, you would have thought he would never show favoritism toward his sons, but he did the same thing. Jacob favored his son Joseph over all of his other sons, and thus a rivalry developed, and it resulted in Joseph being sold. You know, there's bad sibling rivalry when your kids come home and they've sold your son. That's literally what happened. We see the same thing in the home of David. David's father was Jesse. When the prophet Samuel came to Bethlehem, the hometown of David, to select the next king of Israel, he knew that that son, that king, would come from the house of Jesse. So Jesse was told to bring all of his sons before the visiting prophet. And there stood these 7 strapping boys, the magnificent 7. And the prophet looked over each one, and the Lord said, "That's not the one, that's not the one, that's not the one." Finally, Samuel said, "Do you have any other sons? Because none of these are the ones the Lord has chosen." He said, "Well, I have one more. He's out in the field, and he's the youngest of my boys." Now, actually, that phrase that Jesse used for youngest is a word that actually means the least in my estimation. So he said openly, "I think the least of David." And then he was called in, and bounding in from the fields comes young David, and indeed he was the one that the Lord had chosen. And God raised him up to be the greatest king in the history of Israel. But David knew how his father saw him. And that's why David later wrote, "Though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will take me up." Don't provoke your children. Another way we do that is by never complimenting them. Never complimenting them. Maybe it's easier for a mom to be more affirming, to be more nurturing. Fathers want their sons and daughters to be strong so they may withhold the compliments. Maybe fathers will give them more readily to a daughter than they will to a son. But I know growing up, I didn't hear many attaboys. In fact, I don't think I ever heard them. And there was no expression of love in our home. My mom never told me she loved me. There was no hugging. So when you don't show affection toward your children and affirm them, this has a bad impact. Now, I think because of the way that I was raised, I tended to overcompensate, especially with my oldest son, Christopher. When he was a little boy, I spoiled him like crazy. I would go out to toy stores and for no reason buy him a really big toy because I wanted him to have the childhood I never had. I wanted him to know he was loved and valued and treasured. And Christopher and I would come walking in from Toys R Us with some giant toy, and my wife would just roll her eyes like, "What's wrong with you?" And it wasn't until later I realized I think I overdid it a bit. That's why I agree with the statement of Dr. James Dobson when he says, we all owe our oldest child an apology, right? And I think it's because, we're figuring it out the first time around. But children need approval and encouragement in the things that are good every bit as much as they need correction in the things that are not good. Now, my next message will talk a little bit more about parenting, and I'm going to talk about discipline. So we'll get to that later, but for right now, just suffice it to say we need to encourage our children. Now, we can overdo it as well. Maybe that's become a problem. I read an article from the South Florida Sun-Sentinel that had the headline, "When Praising Children Goes Too Far." The article says, parents used to worry about spoiling their kids, so they criticized lavishly and withheld praise. Now, the article says, they worry about self-esteem, so they withhold criticism while praising lavishly. This has resulted in a generation of narcissistic children. I talked about that on my last message. So we want to find the balance of not being overly critical and never affirming, but not overpraising either. So we bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. Don't provoke them, but bring them up. By the way, that phrase, bring them up, means to nourish and to feed. Another translation says, let them be kindly cherished. Notice it says, bring them up. It doesn't say knock them down. Nor does it say, leave them to themselves. What do I mean by that? It means if you are not a hands-on parent, your child is going to be influenced and raised by someone. Proverbs 29:15 says, a child left to himself brings shame to his mother. And that's a problem in a lot of our homes today. Kids are left to themselves. They call them latchkey kids. According to a U.S. census, 1/3 of all school-age children in the United States are for some part of the week latchkey kids. That is, they go home to an empty house or apartment. That number may be as high as 5 to 7 million for children between 5 and 13 years old. So when these kids are all alone, who are they being influenced by? Well, to some degree, their peers, also the public school system. Then there's the media. Then there's the internet. That is why we as parents need to be proactive in raising our children in the way of the Lord. Now we're going to teach them right from wrong. We're going to teach them ethics. We're going to teach them values. We're going to teach them manners. You know, I always taught my sons to be respectful. And when they meet someone, you look them in the eye, you shake their hand, because I see some kids are very disrespectful to adults. And I think that's a result of their upbringing and what they're allowed to do. So we want to teach our children manners. Now, etiquette, maybe that's another thing. I'll leave that to my wife. She's far more proper than I am. In fact, I'm the last person you would want to teach etiquette to your children. My wife has a website called Virtue for Women, and they record little videos for this website. And they were recording the other day over at a friend's house, and they were teaching my granddaughters etiquette. Gina Thompson was showing them the proper way to sit down at a table and eat your food and so forth. And I sort of walked in and kind of crashed it. And here's the result. Look at the video screen.
Not only do we want to be ladies of virtue, we want to raise little ladies of virtue. And I have Riley and Stella and Lucy with me today, and we are going to do our table manners. Oh, do we have a guest here today? Who is here and he's already eating?
That's my papa. Uh-oh.
Well, I got hungry because you're talking so long.
Rule number 1 is you never begin eating until everyone is seated at the table. Look at Papa, he's got a mess on his plate, and what you need to start with first is your napkins. So can everyone hold your napkin up?
And then you do this.
Well, no.
He's out of control. Is he going to
That's what you do.
No, Papa, you do this.
You don't do this and you don't do this, but you just like this, and then put it on your lap.
Is it okay to eat another cupcake yet?
Patience is definitely a virtue.
Well, I guess I'll have to eat it now.
Now he's gonna have to eat it.
You can't.
Oh my goodness. Crazy Papa. With manners and etiquette, we always want to be polite and complimentary. When you like something at the table, you can always tell the cook, thank you so much, this was very good.
What do you do if you don't like it?
If you have nothing nice to say, you don't say anything.
What if it makes
at
you
all.
sick to your stomach? Because I've actually had this happen. I ate the food and it wasn't good, and I was so sick, I didn't even want to swallow it. So you do this. This is a trick. If you take the bite and you're sick, you go like this, you go.
No.
You don't.
Doesn't sound really proper. Ew, yuck! What school did he go to? He went to military school.
Don't listen to Papa.
But what if you don't want to
Papa.
swallow it because it makes you sick?
Well, then you have to say, may I please be excused?
You've taken the bite, you're feeling sick to your stomach.
You shouldn't talk with your mouth full, Papa.
And you shouldn't talk with your mouth full. You would still have to say, may I be excused.
But I've already swallowed it, so now I'm going to probably be sick in the bathroom.
TMI. Too much information.
Somebody needs a time out.
After you swallowed it and the food isn't good, and the person who made it said, how did you like the meal? And it was bad. What do you say?
Well, this is a good
I would
that
say
you
something
like.
like this.
And with manners and etiquette, we always want to think before we speak.
Wow, I've never really had anything like that before.
That's a very good answer. Isn't
That's
that
called
nice? Let's give
diplomacy.
Papa applause for that. That was very nice.
Diplomacy.
Right. Now for a recap of what we've learned. So we want to always remember our please and our thank you, may I be excused, and we will continue to work on our etiquette and manners and become ladies and little ladies of virtue.
I'm going to have to excuse myself
Thank you
so
very
you can
much.
continue on. Bye. I can't take it anymore. I'm actually literally getting bored. All right. So we want to bring our children up, not in etiquette, or at least in the way I teach etiquette, but in the proper way. But we want to bring them up in the way of the Lord. And you know, one thing that's really important as we bring our kids up is we have to understand that they have a sinful nature that's dragging them down. As hard as it is for you to accept, or maybe as easy as it is for you to accept, your children are sinners, right? David said, in sin did my mother conceive me. I mean, we are born sinners. We're not sinners because we sin because we're sinners. It comes naturally. I never had to teach my children to sin. I never had to teach them to be selfish. I mean, I'm amazed at my youngest granddaughter, Allie, when she can hardly even talk, already understands mine. And she'll go over to her older sister and take something she's enjoying and run off with it. And she doesn't even want it. She just wants to torment her sister. And it just comes naturally to all of us. So we have to instruct children. We have to bring them up and point them to Jesus. But listen to this. You cannot lead a child any further than you yourself have gone. You can't lead a child any further than you yourself have gone. Nothing can happen through you until it has first happened to you. Paul said in Philippians 4:9, these things that you've learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. You see, what your children need to see is an example. You can tell them this is what you are to do, but if you contradict it, nothing could be more counterproductive to raising a godly child. You show me a child that's maybe even an adult today who has hardened their heart against God and against the church. And in almost every case, I'll show you a child that was raised in a hypocritical home, a hypocritical Christian home, where the parents said one thing and did another. It's almost like in that approach to parenting, they did everything to raise a hypocrite and a child that's hard against God than to raise one that would follow the Lord. I told you the story before about a father and his young son who were climbing a mountain. And it came to a point where it was getting very difficult, even dangerous. The father stopped to consider which way he should go. The little boy standing behind him called out, I'm coming right behind you, Dad. And the idea was, whatever you do, Dad, I'm going to follow you. I'm going to follow your example. So lead well. And the way to do this is to take lots of time with your kids. I know we hear this phrase, quality time. Listen, quality time is fine, but what kids need is quantity time. They need lots of time with mom and especially Dad. And I say especially Dad because Dad is often out more. So when he's around, he needs to take time for his kids. Moses really gives us the template and how a father is to interact with his children. Deuteronomy 6, he says, these words I'm commanding you today will be in your heart, and you'll teach them diligently to your sons, and talk of them when you sit down in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. That's very important. Moses is saying, talk about them when you sit down, when you're walking, wherever you are. Look for these opportunities. Look for those teaching moments. Instead of telling your kids they can't watch TV with them. They won't like this, by the way. Or the video game, say, let me play with you. Let me see what it is you're playing. They might say, I don't know if I really want to play right now so much, because now dad's there or mom's there. And you're going to take that as an opportunity to instruct them. So maybe you're watching some sitcom on TV and something is said, and you pause it and say, let me explain to you what's really going on here. Here's what is being conveyed. And you are able to help them in doing that to form a Christian world view. But listen to this. When a child gets older, they're going to start to push back. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. In many ways, it's a good thing, because it means they're starting to think for themselves. They're not just accepting what you say at face value. Sometimes parents freak out when their kids say, how do you know the Bible is the Word of God? How can I know Jesus Christ is real? Why is there suffering in the world? What about this? What about that? No, those are great opportunities to help them to learn to think for themselves. And listen, even if your child goes astray for a time, that does not mean that somehow you have failed as a parent. If we were to hold every parent responsible for wayward children, then we would have to say that God himself is not a good father. Now, why do I say that? Because God the Father has a lot of prodigal sons and daughters. So even if your child goes astray for a time, it doesn't mean you have failed. You just hold your course and you keep praying for them. Again, coming back to this phrase, train up a child in the way that they should go. By the way, this phrase, train up, is specifically speaking of the actions of a midwife who, after delivering a child, would dip her finger and crush dates. This would result in providing a thirst in the baby. So the idea of training up is create a thirst in the child. A thirst for what? Not just a thirst for milk, but a thirst for truth, a thirst for God. But in verb form, this phrase, train up, speaks of bringing a horse into submission. So the idea is breaking a horse. And, you know, I saw a program on a while ago about a man who they call a horse whisperer. And it's not so much beating the horse, but it's a way that he learns to communicate with that animal and ultimately gets it to do what he wants it to do. And so that's the idea. You internally motivate them, but you also have external parameters that you place in their life. And this comes down to knowing when to discipline and knowing when to effectively, well, I hate to use this word, bribe. You know, sometimes I'll say, if you do this, there's a reward waiting for you. If you do not do this, there's a punishment waiting for you. And knowing how to use those 2 points of reference to get your child to go in the right direction. Train up a child in the way that they should go. Now, does that mean that our parenting pretty much is over with when our kids reach their teen years or when they're 21? Not really. Because the word that is used here for child describes a young boy. It also is used to describe Ishmael in his preteen years. It describes Joseph at age 17, and in another reference, it describes a young man ready for marriage. Therefore, when the Bible says, train up a child, it's not just speaking of a small baby, or even a toddler, or even a teenager. The idea is you do it from infancy to young adulthood. So put this all together. What does it mean to train up a child in the way that they should go? It means create a thirst in, build into the child from infancy to adulthood the experience of submission to God. You provide external boundaries for their protection, but internal motivation for them to know and love the Lord, and train them in the way that they should go. Now that's an interesting phrase too, because that can be translated according to their bent. The Amplified Bible translates that verse this way: train up a child in the way he should go, that is in keeping with individual gift or bent, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. You see, each child has their own unique bent, and that means that every child is different. Our two sons, Christopher and Jonathan, could not have been any more different. Christopher, you had to tell him and tell him and tell him and tell him again, and he would keep doing the thing you told him not to do. Jonathan, on the other hand, you told him once, and he was compliant. And I'm really seeing this now with granddaughters and a grandson. You know, I have 4 little granddaughters, and the way that little girls play is so interesting to me. You know, I have these little dolls, I've bought them. They're called Lala Loopsies, okay? Have you heard of those? Anyway, if you have girls, you have, but they're these weird little plastic dolls, and they have accessories, and the girls line them all up, and they take the accessories with each Lala Loopsie, and they're all there in their little house and the little car and all the things I've got them. And then my grandson, Christopher, he's not even a year old yet, and his job is to search and destroy. You know, he just takes things and smashes them and picks things up and bangs them. I got this one toy where you take a hammer and pound little balls. He loves that. And I just thought, it's just built in them, isn't it? Every child is different. You have to figure that out. Some are more sensitive. Some are more belligerent. Some are more this, some are more that. But you just do your part. And speaking of grandparents for a moment, I even like that phrase, grandfather. You're not just a father, you're a grandfather. I like that. And grandmother. Grandchildren are the reward for the pain of parenting and the punishment to our children for all they put us through. Don't you think? You see, grandfathers are daddies with extra practice. And here are sort of the rules of grandparenting. I've put them up here on the screen so you can write them down. The to-do list for grandparents. Number 1, pick up children. Number 2, spoil them. Number 3, load them with sugar. Number 4, send them home. That is your mission. When I pick up my grandkids, I say, the fun now officially begins. But even when we raise our children in the way of the Lord, sometimes they rebel, as I mentioned. But I think that we have to understand that just happens, and we need to be patient, and we need to keep praying. I can't emphasize how important it is to not just send your children to church, but to take them to church. You know, studies show that if you don't go to church for a month, the odds are 2 to 1 that you won't go for more than a year. And another study disclosed if mom and dad attend church regularly, listen, if mom and dad attend church regularly, 72% of their children will remain faithful in attendance. If only dad attends, 55% of the children will remain faithful. If only mom attends regularly, 15% will remain faithful. If neither mom or dad attend regularly, only 6% will remain faithful. So you see the importance of an example to lead our children in the way that they should go. And one day our job will be done. Our job is done with our oldest son, Christopher. And this is why Father's Day is hard for me, as many days are. But this day is in particular because our son went to be with the Lord 5 years ago, as you know. And, you know, I miss him. He made me the most amazing Father's Day cards every year. And he was an artist, and each one was custom. I have many of them sitting on my shelf in my office, and I look at them often. But, it's really difficult to not have him here. But, I did the best that I could do as a father, and my wife did the best that she could do as a mom. And my son Christopher did go through a prodigal time in his life, and he went astray for a number of years. But thankfully, he came back to the Lord, recommitted his life to Christ, and served the Lord for the 3 years preceding his departure to heaven. His younger brother, Jonathan, also went through a prodigal time. Interestingly, as Christopher's was ending, Jonathan's was in full swing. And they had a conversation. Jonathan said that Christopher was the closest person to him on earth, and he would share things with Christopher he would never share with mom and dad. And one day Christopher said to Jonathan, "What's it going to take for you to get right with God?" And Jonathan wanted to carry the conversation on the next day, but tragically the next day was the day, July 24th, 2008, when Christopher died in an automobile accident. So he was never able to have that conversation. But Jonathan, through that, recommitted his life to Christ. Now he's serving the Lord. He himself is a parent of 3 children, 2 daughters, and a son, and is walking with the Lord. And so we just do what we are able to do, and we pass this legacy on to our children. But let me just close by saying that there might be some of us here who are running from God. You know, I've mentioned our children going astray. Sometimes we as God's children go astray. And I want you to know that our Father loves us, and he calls us back to himself, and he wants to adopt us into his family. One thing I left out of my own story, and many of you have heard before, but I was adopted. In the middle of all of my father's, so-called, I should say my mother's husbands, because none of them treated me as a father. She married one guy who was the best of the lot, and ironically, he was an attorney. That's a joke, get it? Ironically, he was an attorney. His name was Oscar Felix Laurie. Oscar Laurie, unlike the other men my mom married, didn't drink, he didn't smoke, and he didn't like to party. He was a moral man, he was a good man, and he loved me as a father should love a son. Unfortunately, my time with him there in New Jersey was very short, but in the time that we had together, I always thought of him as my dad, and he adopted me, as I said, and I carry his name today. But God adopts us into his family, and he treats us as a father should treat a son or a daughter. And the Bible says, we have not received the spirit of bondage again to fear, but one of adoption whereby we cry, Abba, Father.